They will be in next week's newsletter, okay?
This is exciting. Peter has decided he's going to do our newsletter. He really missed it and decided he would work for it. Yay!
Oh, sure.
Thank you. So if anybody needs a card who wants an announcement for, we'll take any pieces of paper. Peter's very adjustable there.
Accommodating.
Accommodating.
Hi, my name is Monica, and I'm with the Amberley Dems, but I have several signs with me today, and some in the back if you wish to purchase them. Some of they are Nepalese, instead of Spanish. The top part is now Nepalese. How about that for a change up? So $10 covers the cost of it. Thank you very much.
We had one person in our group buy the sign, and someone put 12 roses on his car, saying, "Thank you for inviting us to be your neighbor." I thought it was so nice. That's when I got a sign. Nobody's given me roses yet. Okay, any other announcements? Here we go.
Thank you.
Martha.
I just wonder if others got a call from Bernie Sanders yesterday. Did you? Okay.
Yes.
For those that may not have, asking us to vote yes on issue 2 on drugs.
He did. He wants us to write.
I'm sorry?
He wants us to do yes.
Yes. Yes, he wants yes.
Patty.
Hi, I'm, is this on? Okay. I would like to ask all of you, if you would please take a moment to call Governor Kasich's office. He still has scheduled the execution of Alva Campbell for a week from tomorrow. Just remind him that there's no need for executions, there's been no public outcry for executions, that the recommendations from the task force have not even been discussed in our legislature. The direct number to his office is, if you have a pencil and paper or sitting afterwards, the direct number to Governor Kasich's office is 614-466-3555. And if you didn't get it, you can see me later. Thank
And
you.
it's going to be in the newsletter, right, Peter? Yeah, it'll be in the newsletter. Trinity, hand the microphone to Peter again.
I would just add, in connection with the speakers, the one reason against the execution is precisely the number of people who have been shown to be falsely accused. This is just an appeal. If anyone really is smart with computers, I would love to know how to have the newsletter have a single little address instead of all 360 names. I'm just...
Well, you may know.
I can answer it too, Peter.
Oh, good. Somebody knows and it's going to help Peter. Yay. Any other announcements?
May I just ask, how do we find the newsletter? I've never read it.
Well, it should be coming to your email address.
And we assumed it from, okay, who do I give the email address to?
Oh, Peter.
To Peter. He has mine, but I just
In order to do
And you haven't gotten
I
it?
get a Gmail address because Miami University wouldn't allow you to have more than 20 names on a thing. So I got a Gmail address, and they allow me to have all 350 on there. But for some reason, you must not have been on the original list. I can add you to that original list. You have my personal Miami one.
Okay, I would like to mention, could you hand me this paper there? I have one copy. It's too expensive for me to get to everybody, but I would, on every table, I put one of these copies. It's from the October 2017 Ohio League Leader Updates. It gives you some information on the various statewide ballot issues, and it talks about things that the league is involved with and is currently concerned about. And for instance, number 2 is the voter purge case. It's called Houston versus A. Philip Randolph Institute. A lawsuit challenging Ohio Secretary of State John Husted's voter purge was scheduled for oral arguments before the Supreme Court on November 8th. Notice they put it after the election, but has been postponed to January. The League of Women Voters filed an amicus brief in partnership with the Brennan Center for Justice, arguing that Ohio's voter roll maintenance process illegally prevents duly registered citizens across the state from exercising their franchise and making their voices heard. This one also gives the update on the Fair District's campaign updates. So see this for, I could have had a whole meeting just on this, what's happening in this announcements here. So check this one out. State legislature news. That one of the things that I miss hearing about in my local newspaper is the state legislature news. We used to hear about what kinds of things were before the House and the Senate in the old days when we had a real newspaper. But that seems to have disappeared. But there are 5 bullets here for you to find out what's going on with the state legislature. And go on, please just look at this and see what's happening. And there's an email address or an address here so you can look it up yourself and actually get it so that you can enlarge it and read it. But I spent the time and effort to print all of these copies out, even though it's only 1 per table, so that you would have that information, because there's just so much information going on right now. And let me tell you that Republican legislature is going at it here in Ohio. So, sad news, but it's in here. Find out what's happening. Any other announcements? Other announcements? We are going to go on to our speakers. We have 2 speakers today. We have, our 2 speakers are Dean Gillespie over here. He's the cute one with the beard. And then we have Donald Castor, the handsome one behind me. So he's the actual lawyer who's involved with the Innocence Project, and I'm going to let them describe themselves. But Donald is from UC Law. He's been working in civil rights and marriage equality. He sounds like one of the good guys from just the onset. So without further ado, I want to have introduced to you our pair for today, and they said that they're going to start with Donald. Here we go.
Good afternoon. Let me just clarify. I told our host that I spent the early part of my career with Al Gerhardstein, who's the lawyer, of course, who represented Jim Obergefell and who did the marriage equality cases. I had left Al long before he did the marriage equality cases,
Hold the mic near enough.
although I was, definitely supportive of his efforts there, but I was with OIP by then. So I've been with the Ohio Innocence Project since 2012. I'm a 2003 graduate of the University of Cincinnati College of Law, which is where OIP is now. So I am watching today's mayoral election results probably even more eagerly than this group is, because I have personal ties to both of the candidates. On the one hand, John Cranley, of course, was a co-founder of OIP. His wife Dean has served on our board for a very long time, both instrumental to the work of OIP. On the other hand, I've known Yvette Simpson for 15 years. She was a year behind me in law school, and I've been proud to call her a friend for 15 years. So I've just been rooting for both of them on the sideline, despite the fact that most other people have very strong preferences for one or the other. OIP was founded in 2003. Since we were founded, 25 people have been released on grounds of innocence as a result of the work of the project, serving well over 400 total years in prison wrongfully. Dean is one of our exonerees. He spent 20 years in prison for a rape he did not commit. He'll talk more about his experience with the criminal justice system when he gets up here in a couple of minutes. I wanted to talk for a couple of minutes about the work that we do and how we do it. We are a part of the law school at UC. We have 3 full-time faculty members, as well as our director, Mark Gotze, who's also obviously a full-time faculty member. We have a couple of administrative people and a couple of lawyers who work on a temporary basis, usually young lawyers who come in, help for a period of time, and go on to really get their careers going after that. We our work begins when an inmate writes into us and says, hey, I didn't do this, can you help me out? We are very selective about who we help, not because we think that everybody is guilty, but because the standards for getting someone out of prison after they've been convicted are very, very high. They should be high, right? It shouldn't be easy to walk someone out the front door of a prison. But since they are exceedingly high, we know there's only a few people who we can actually help. Since we were founded, we have received over 8,000 requests for assistance. We've gone to court asserting innocence on behalf of about 40 of them. And we've been successful in 25 of those cases. So, that's not to say we think there's only a 0.5% error rate in the Ohio courts. There was some discussion of the death penalty a couple minutes ago and the error rate there. I can tell you that I think in 2014, the National Academy of Sciences estimated that if there's a 4% error rate nationally in the death penalty, which means 1 out of every 25 people on death row should not be there. There's currently 138 people right now on Ohio's death row. So assuming that Ohio is no better or worse at death penalty than any other state is, we are slated to execute at least 5 or 6 individuals who should not be executed. The lifeblood of our project, in addition to besides the inmates, of course, who write into us, is the law students who work with us. Law school is a 3-year course of study after college. Most of our students start the summer after their first year of law school. They work full-time for the summer, about 40 hours a week, and then through their second school year, they work part-time during the school year alongside of their classes. Right now, we have 21 law students working with us. They are amazing. Every year we get a new infusion of talent and energy and passion. I hear a lot of talk about how millennials will be the undoing of civilization, but having worked closely with them for the last 5 years, I am not worried at all about whether or not they'll find a way to get my Social Security check paid 20 years from now. And when we get a request for assistance, we basically start from scratch in trying to determine what happened. We will look at what the courts did, we'll look at the trial transcripts, we'll look at any opinions that were generated by the trial court or the Court of Appeals, but then we do our own investigation. We write letters to anybody who might have records on the case. We look to see if there's the possibility that some physical evidence was collected that might have DNA on it that was never tested. We literally had students crawling around in dusty evidence rooms and storage facilities looking for things that police departments and clerks of court thought had been lost long ago and finding evidence in boxes that were long forgotten. We'll go out and we'll start to interview witnesses who the police missed, and we'll re-interview witnesses who may have a different story to tell with the passage of time. We'll obviously talk to the inmate who's written into us. We'll go up and visit crime scenes and see if the way things were described was physically possible. We'll look back at historic records to see what the lighting conditions outside were. Whatever it takes to get a sense of what actually happened, we'll go ahead and do. For us, the best case scenario is that there's DNA available in a case. If that's true, then we'll file a motion with the court seeking DNA testing. Even though we're part of the College of Law at the University of Cincinnati, all of our work is privately funded. You may have heard in the paper recently, or about a year ago now, or 2 years ago now, the Rosenthal family is a very generous supporter of the Ohio Innocence Project. And there are many, many other people throughout the city and throughout the state of Ohio who have been very generous both with their time and with their finances in supporting the work that we do. Dean Gillespie is one of our more outspoken exonerees. Dean was the first client of OIP. As he was becoming a client, I was literally, I'm going to sit down, I'm sorry, my back's bothering me a little bit, but I'll stay with the mic since I'm better to listen to than to look at. Dean was literally, Dean's like, oh, I've always said that about you, dude. Dean was literally becoming a client of the project as I was graduating from law school. His mom, before Mark Godsey, who's our director, had even started working at the University of Cincinnati, There had been some publicity that Mark was coming over to UC from Northern Kentucky, where he had been working, was going to start the Innocence Project, and Dean's mom tracked him down and said, "You've got to help my son." So Dean became the very first client of OIP. That was in 2003. Through Mark's work and the work of lots and lots of students over the years, Dean finally walked out of prison in 2011. Even though he walked out of prison in 2011, his exoneration just became final about 6 months ago. So 5 months ago, close. So these things take an enormous amount of time, an enormous amount of effort, an enormous amount of hands and brains and hearts looking at these cases to try to figure out what went wrong and how to correct it. Dean was accused of rape up in Montgomery County. There was never any physical evidence linking him to the crime. There was simply some faulty eyewitness identifications that weren't even made until 2 years after the crime had been committed. When we look at exonerations, when we focus on DNA-based exonerations, we know that the leading cause of a wrongful conviction is in fact a bad eyewitness identification. The second leading cause, and the first if we limit our inquiry to murder cases, is actually false confessions. Those are the two things that the criminal justice system is working to correct right now, and there's been a lot of focus right now. Ohio actually passed a law several years ago in 2012 on eyewitness identification techniques. We no longer use the old six-pack. Dean will show you when he talks about the six-pack that was used to identify him. That's, you've all seen the Law and Order type shows where they show a witness 6 pictures on a piece of paper. Law enforcement calls that a six-pack. And it's probably about as reliable as if you chugged a six-pack first and then decided who your suspect is going to be. We have a better system now in Ohio for doing that. It's been studied. We know from the science that it's less likely to lead to false identifications, while no less likely to lead to proper identifications. There's also been a lot of study of interrogation methods in the United States. Most law enforcement agencies use something called the Reed technique. Named the Reed technique because there's a guy named Reed who wrote a book about how to interrogate witnesses. The problem with the Reed technique is that the police officers are taught never to interrogate a suspect who they don't believe is guilty. Police officers believe they do interviews in 2 parts. They do first an interview and then they do an interrogation. By the time you're being interrogated in a little room, the police officer already believes you are guilty. The detective is no longer interested in getting to the truth because the detective believes he or she has already found the truth. By the time you are being interrogated, the sole goal of law enforcement using a Reed technique is to get a confession from you. These are the issues that we work on. We work on issues of junk science. We know that there are several different kinds of science that have been used in courts in Ohio and throughout the nation in the past that just aren't good, that aren't valid. You used to hear about on the CSI type shows all the time, hair comparison. Put a couple pieces of hair under a microscope and you can tell whether they came from the same person. No, you can't. And the FBI trained people to go out and do this work. The FBI agrees that it's junk, and they've collaborated with the National Innocence Project to go through all of these cases and help to undo the damage that was done through some of these testimonies that never should have been given. A couple of years ago, our Innocence Project identified a scientist who worked for the state crime lab for literally decades. And it turned out that she had significant mental health issues. Now, mental health issues don't mean you can't do your job and do it well. In her case, though, her supervisor had written a memo that said that the consensus in the lab is that her mental health issues were affecting her work and that she would stretch the truth to satisfy a law enforcement agency. Meaning that when a law enforcement agency submitted a piece of evidence to her and told her this is the guy we think did it, does it link back to our guy? She would say yes, because she wanted to make the law enforcement agency happy. The Ohio Innocence Project just received a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice, which I never thought would happen after Trump was elected, to be perfectly honest. But we've recently received a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice to hire an attorney for 2 years, and all the attorney will do is look back over the hundreds of cases that this scientist worked on over the course of her career to determine who is sitting in prison, who shouldn't. That is a result of the first case that came out, the case in which the rogue scientist was identified. He was a guy by the name of Jim Parsons, who did over 20 years for murdering his wife. He did not murder his wife. The testimony that the lab scientist gave was just completely invalid and shouldn't have been given. We were able to get him out of prison, and he was in his 70s by the time he got out. He survived for about a year before he passed away from some illnesses he developed while leaving the institution. But these are the dangers of rogue scientists and junk science. So that's sort of a little overview of the work we do. Like I said at the beginning, Dean is far more interested than I am. So I want to turn things over to Dean to let him talk a bit about his experience with the criminal justice system.
I'm going to try to do this without this microphone. Can you hear me? No. No.
Real close to your mouth.
Automatic no. No. Okay, here we go then. 20 years in prison for crimes I didn't commit. Basically, it was, I worked at General Motors, and my dad worked at General Motors, and he got me a job at the factory. I was a fireman at General Motors, plant protection fireman, and didn't know it at the time, but the guy that I was working for had a friend of his who he wanted to get the job, didn't get the job, so from that day on, he didn't like me. I didn't know this, for several years, but he was an ex-police officer and wanted me out of there and gone, so he started going to the police department where he used to work, trying to just get me hooked up on something. And we've proven that he went down there 4 different occasions to try to get me just, hooked on something and fired. And it didn't happen. So this case was 2.5 years old. He went down with this information on this case. There was a poster hanging in the factory, and he said, "Oh, this is your guy right here." The detectives that were on the scene that night were still the detectives on the case. Looked into it. They looked at my DMV. They seen, there was evidence in the file that showed the guy's pant size would be one of them. And so they looked at my driver's license and seen that, well, there's no way this guy could have fit in the pants. I couldn't have fit him in the 6th grade. Much less then. So they, see that something's wrong here. Something's going on. This guy's been down here too many times, and so they disregarded me as a suspect on this whole thing. And a few years later, my boss's best friend's son became the detective on the case. So he takes the file, wipes it out, starts a whole new file on me. And now I'm the prime suspect now, and go through the whole process, go to court, get sentenced to 22 to 56 years in prison for crimes I did not commit. Passed 3 polygraph tests. I did everything you could possibly do to prove your innocence, and they still just railroaded it. And so I do 16 years, go see the parole board. The parole board gives you more time. The parole board wants you to admit guilt and show remorse. How do you admit guilt and show remorse to something you absolutely did not do? During my trial, the prosecutor came to my lawyer and offered me 30 days. Said 30 days, go through receptions and you'll be out. And I told him 30 days, 30 minutes, 30 years. I did not commit this crime. I will never say I did. So the next numbers I got out of them was 22 to 56, and I did 20 of those. So go to the parole board, they do all this stuff. The last time I seen the parole board was in 2011. And when I seen him, by that time, Jim Petro, used to be the Attorney General, had wrote a book, him and his wife had wrote a book called False Justice, about my case, Clarence Elkins, one of our clients, and Michael Green out of Cleveland. So there was a book wrote about the injustices to me. Lori Quinlivan out of Cincinnati here done a lot of news stories when she was with the I-Team on my case, probably 6 or 8 stories on it, you know, how did this happen, why did this happen, and things like that. So there was all that. The Innocence Project had put a clemency packet together that was, you know, a foot thick, and turned it to the governor, and the parole board had that also. So I go see the parole board. Now, this is all I'm going to say about the parole board because I can't stand them, and I'm not allowed to talk about them anymore because I talk so bad about them. They said, Mr. Gillespie, it appears you may be innocent, but we're not here to judge innocence or guilt. We're here to impose the sentence the court ordered, and gave me 4 more years. And you say, how can you say something like that and go to sleep at night? And they said I was being combative. They called a guard in, you know, they take you out, drag you out, and all that stuff. So within the next 8 months, I was released. The Innocence Project finally released me to federal court. We found the 2 detectives that were on duty the night these crimes happened and when this guy was doing this, and they had information showing the files that they had before compared to what they had when this guy started the cases, my boss's best friend's son. So one guy was in Arizona, one was in Florida. They came to testify to the federal court, proved a Brady violation, prosecutorial misconduct, police misconduct. So that I was released December 22nd, 2011. When you're released from prison like that, it's like a dream. You can't believe this just happened. And so the first 3 days I didn't go to sleep. And in the first 3 days, which is the 22nd of December, everyone's home for the holidays. 600 people come to see me at my parents' house to visit me. They knew, you know, everyone knew that I did do this. My friend kept everything on social media, letting them know when we had hearings or when something was coming up with my case, so everyone knew what was going on. So 5 months later, the state court threw my case out also on an alternate suspect, which we had a anonymous call come in that they pretty much knew who the guy was who'd done this because he'd done this exact same thing before, and he was a prison guard. So, yeah, he was at the Lebanon prison facility, and I was at the Warren prison in Mason, so they're right above each other. And so they got all their information, started tracking him down, and started tracking down some people that he knew, and we presented that to the court, and the state court threw the case out on alternate suspect also, which you're talking about super rare to have 2 separate courts throw a case out on 2 completely different issues. It was unbelievable. He was talking about the 6-pack and how this goes so wrong. In my case, the cop was so corrupt. It was terrible. It was absolutely terrible. But he had set this 6-pack up with his wife. He would put it together, show it to her and say, do you know who to pick? She'd be like, no. So he would do it again, show it to her, do you know who to pick? No. So finally, this is the photo lineup that he used, and this is completely illegal, but the court accepted it. This is the photo lineup he used to show to the people. Do you know who to pick out of that thing? The Dayton Daily News said it was everything but circled and starred. You know, so, and all the 5 guys that are in this are cops. They're all 5 cops. So that's how bad the photo lineup thing is. The interesting thing was, so when we get the tip on the guy, by this time the Petros are working on the case and with the Innocence Project, and so Nancy Petro gets this great idea of the composite sketch from the night of the crime. This is half of the composite sketch from the night of the crime, right here. So she took a photograph. The guy who done this had been arrested 4 separate times for this. No one would testify against him. They had kicked the door in on his place. At one point, he had a woman handcuffed to his bed at his house when they came in. And that woman has never been seen again. She was the only one who was going to testify against him. and she hasn't been seen since. So the Butler County Sheriffs have been investigating him on a murder on that, but this actually went nowhere. So this is the person who we believe, must say that, committed the crimes. And the federal courts agree, or the state courts agree, there's enough evidence of that. So when you take the composite drawing and then his photo, they've done a pretty good job on that sketch, if you ask me. And he lives in Cincinnati, just so you know. So, if anybody's got any questions, just throw your hand
So I
up.
didn't understand, so, about the picture, they put two pictures.
That's his photo and then the sketch. This is half of a photo of one of the times he was arrested. This is the sketch the night of the crime, the night that it happened. So there's a whole lot of theories on whys and hows and you know the reasons these things happen. Mark Godsey, our director, just wrote a book called Blind Injustice, and you got to read it. He was a federal prosecutor. He knows both sides of this thing here. You know, Donald sit down here. He's talking about he's a lawyer, he's a this, and this guy's a superhero. He's gotten people out of prison for crimes they didn't commit. Mark Godsey, another. That's like Superman. It's like the whole superhero Batcave down there at UC. Mark Godsey has helped set up 18 different innocence projects in 18 different countries in the world. I was just in Italy. I was the first exoneree to speak at the International Innocence Conference in Italy. And they have an innocence project because Mark Godsey. And all these other countries were there because of Mark Godsey. This is all out of UC. This whole UC project is global. You know, they're huge. And it's a great organization. I've been very fortunate to be asked to be on the board of the Innocence Project. So to be a part of the future steps and the future processes of the people who saved my life is be the greatest honor I've ever had. And one other thing about being in Italy, probably will never happen in the United States of America as long as I'm alive. The Italian Supreme Court Justice was sitting right beside me on stage, learning and understanding about wrongful incarcerations and how they happen and things like that. Yeah, I don't believe there'll be a Supreme Court Justice in America do that anytime soon. They have different thoughts on this whole issue. So who's got some questions? Yes?
You were talking about prosecutorial misconduct. Did anything specifically happen to the people that were involved in this little conspiracy?
The detective retired. That's a whole, let me tell you, I have this beautiful girlfriend, her name's Karma. And the detective who did this to me, the night that I got arrested, or the night that I got out, 3 days later, his wife went to prison for stealing $340,000 from the company she works for.
Oh, jeez.
Now, this is something I can't figure out. My wife steals $340,000. I'm gonna help her spend it. So, why didn't he get in trouble? What's going on here? What happened there? Nothing happened to him. Yeah, the detective who came with him the night they arrested me told my mother I would never see the light of day again. And this was just when they were arresting me. He was fired from his job after 20 plus years of abusing his authority. The clerk at the police station had gotten tired of it and finally blew the whistle on him after a 17-year-old girl was caught shoplifting. They pepper sprayed her. She was being combative. They pepper sprayed her. The medics came. They, cleaned her up, got her ready. Everything was cleaned up. Took her to the jail. He personally went down, stripped the girl 5 separate occasions, and videotaped it and sent it to his buddies. Any man in this room or any other person in this room videotapes 17-year-old person, sends it to their buddies. It's called child pornography, and you're going to prison. He got fired, later became wrongful termination, got his job back and retired. So that's the brotherhood they have at this police department. So Karma is coming around visiting quite a few of them, and it's pretty nice. But officially nothing's happened. 2.5 years ago, we filed for my compensation. We had to put it on a stay due to the prosecutor fighting every single thing that has happened in my case. But Mark called me one day and he said, you know what's happening today? And I said, what's that, little buddy? He said, there's a whole lot of people crapping on the front door because they got a subpoena for being in the lawsuit. And the interesting thing about that, they all wanted to start telling on each other then. Where were you at when they were doing this to me? When they were sending me to prison for something I didn't do? Why wasn't you saying something then? So we got people from the crime lab and General Motors and different places who told what happened. So that's going to be interesting here coming up soon.
Did you ever get your job back?
I wouldn't take it back. You couldn't run me down with a truck and make me take it. I am not employed, nor am I seeking employment.
Was it because of the collusive atmosphere at GM and them?
No, they wiped GM off the face of the earth in Dayton. There's no GM plants even in existence.
Oh, really?
Yeah, there was 14 GM plants in Dayton, and none of them are there now. Actually, all the GM factories that I worked at are completely gone. There's nothing there but grass.
In China.
Exactly, in Mexico. Yeah.
Right here.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, what was the name of the organization where the statistic came from, the 4% error in the death penalty?
I'll have to direct that to my lawyer.
That was the National Academy of Sciences.
And we do have the death penalty thing here. We do have one of our guys, Tyrone Nolan, is on death row, and we're fighting like crazy. Actually, I'm pretty confident that the person who actually committed crime did confess before he died, right? Yeah, but he's still on death row, and he has an execution date. And Ohio has fired that machine up. I just spoke at Schroeder High School with a guy named Derek Wayne Jameson. He spent 20 years on death row, watched 18 guys get executed. He had 6 days of execution. Now, if you know what a stay of execution is, they come to your cell door, eight officers, the warden, the chaplain, and a doctor to check your veins if you're going to be good enough to shoot the poison into you and kill you, and ask you what your last meal is. I don't know how you could actually be a functioning human being after the first one. I don't know how you could do it. And this guy had 6 days, so you have life without parole. Use it. You can't bring someone back from the dead. There's he gave you the number on the amount of guys who've been exonerated in America. As of Friday, the National Registry of Exonerees, there was 2,113 people who've been exonerated in the United States of America. That totals over 18,730 years of wrongful incarceration time. With our group, we've got 480 years down here in Cincinnati with 25 people. Entirely too much time for people to be in prison. We did have the longest serving innocent man, Ricky Jackson. Spent 39 years for crimes he did not commit. He was on death row. They'd done away with the death penalty, otherwise he would have been executed. 75, they'd done away with the death penalty for like 2 years and reinstated it. There's a guy in Georgia now who did 41 years, so he just beat that record. But yet we need to use the life without instead of this death penalty thing.
When I Googled your organization, it sounded to me as though DNA testing was a kind of crucial factor in your initial thing. I'm just curious now, do you have a sense of what proportion of cases have been solved by the use of DNA?
Stats man.
I don't have that statistic handy. I can tell you that in the early days of OIP, it was larger than it is now. And that's for a couple reasons. First of all, in the mid to late 2000s, OIP partnered up with the Columbus Dispatch to do a project called 30 for 30, or no, not 30 for 30, that's an ESPN show. The Dispatch 30, where they identified 30 cases where inmates had filed on their own DNA petitions that were sort of languishing in front of the courts. OIP and the Dispatch worked together to sort of move those along and get them fought. The other thing is that most of the easy DNA cases have been resolved now. Because now if a case is taken to trial, if there's DNA, it'll be tested prior to trial. So most of the easy DNA cases have been done. Now when we look at a DNA, most of the time, either it's a very small quantity of DNA or it is the suspect's profile is going to be mixed in with 2 or 3 other people's DNA, and the interpretation gets more and more difficult. But the means of interpretation and the sensitivity of DNA testing has gotten better and better over the years to allow us to go back in and retest those cases where results wouldn't have been possible before.
I have 2 questions. One, if you have an opinion about Marcy's law proposal. The other is, how do you envision your life going on from here?
I'm gonna let the lawyer answer the Marcy Law thing because I'm so mad about it, it doesn't make no sense. Fortunately for me, my parents are still alive. So when I got out of prison, I was able to go home. My brothers and sisters have been very successful in life and helped me, get through. So I'm 52 years old, I live with my parents and I love it. Said no one. So now I consider myself a daycare senior provider and keep them from killing each other over the remote control. But me and my dad go fishing all the time, and I just got done remodeling a 1963 Airstream camper. So me and my girlfriend are going all over the country just speaking in camp. I've been 19,000 miles in the last 30 days. I was able to go to Ireland and speak over there, and spent 10 days in Ireland. Came home, went from Cleveland to Kentucky to Indiana, and then speaking everywhere in between, and then went to Rome, Italy to speak at the International Innocence Conference and back. So I've been very fortunate. I looked out a cell window that was this big and seen nothing but a gray wall. Now I'm looking out an airplane window the same size, seeing the world. This is what I got from the prison system. So I've been, it's been a great, to be associated with the Innocence Project and to be able to do this right here. This is the greatest thing. Last night I was at Ohio State. Tomorrow I'll be in Cincinnati with Mark's going to be speaking at the Mercantile Library there about his book. Friday I was at Schroeder High School. Just to be able to go out and do this, this is what I love doing. And, for me it's therapy. It's therapy for me. Anyone who's been through this type of situation suffers from some form of PTSD, and this is what I do. Plus, my boat's called My Therapy too, so my fishing boat with my dad. But I'll let him answer the Marcy thing, a little more technical.
Well, first of all, let me make clear, I speak only for myself, not for the Ohio Innocence Project. OIP takes no position on political issues, candidates, blah, 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 blah.
Right.
I am a big-time no on issue 1 person. Issue 1 is a solution in search of a problem that does not exist, and it's going to create problems that don't exist. And there's broad agreement across the political spectrum that Marcy's law is a bad idea. Joe Dieters has broken with the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association to support it, but OPAA, the Ohio Prosecuting Attorneys Association, says no on issue 1, as does the Ohio Association of Defense Lawyers. Our former prosecutor, Mike Allen, was on 700 this morning saying no on issue 1. First of all, we already have victims' rights enshrined both in the Ohio Constitution and in Ohio statute. Second of all, this is worded in such a way, despite what Fraser Crane says in the commercials, that's completely vague, overly broad. You don't know what exactly is going to come of it once it's implemented. Prosecutors already routinely confer with victims. They already make sure that victims' privacy is protected. There's something in the amendment about making sure that victims don't have to talk to defense lawyers prior to trial. They already don't. Back when I was a defense attorney, there's no way I could make a victim talk to me. So that stuff doesn't exist. Unfortunately, there's terrible language in there that sort of raises the victim's role in plea bargaining to an extent that may not be lawful. It also gives victims the alleged right to refuse to submit to discovery requests prior to trial, which likely would not withstand a federal constitutional challenge. Ohio already does it very, and let me be clear, as an Innocence Project attorney, I am not anti-victim at all. Our project, this is not uniform across the country, across all projects, but our project does not contact victims as part of our investigation, because we don't want to re-traumatize any victim. So when we were investigating, and when I say we, I mean people who were at OIP long before I was, when they were investigating Dean's case, nobody ever called the victim in Dean's case from OIP, because we don't want to re-traumatize that person. That's not what we want to do. And in fact, in some of the cases that get resolved, the actual perpetrator will be found as a result of the work that's done. One of the earliest exonerations in Ohio was actually done by the National Innocence Project, Michael Green, talked about in False Justice. As a result of the DNA testing, the actual perpetrator was found, and that was a rape case up in Cleveland. What that means is that essentially because the police messed it up, and in that case there was a rogue forensic scientist who really messed it up, that victim was victimized twice. That victim was victimized by her rapist, and she was victimized again by the criminal justice system, who put the wrong guy in and made her go through it again 20 some odd years later. So I am pro-victim, OIP is pro-victim, but from a personal standpoint, I think Marcy's Law is a big mess that Ohio doesn't need, and that is not going to protect victims' rights, and is going to unconstitutionally interfere with defendants' rights.
And the Ohio Parole Board has a victim. Yeah, they have a person on the parole board, which makes no sense to me. You have a victims' rights person on the parole board. It's an automatic no vote, but you're still paying them $110,000 to sit there and say no. Just take a no vote and quit paying $110,000. There's 10 people on that parole board that make $110,000 a year, and they have no. They don't know who they're talking to when they're talking to someone that's up for parole. All they know is what's put in front of them by the police, and the night of the whole crime thing, and that's it. As far as personally knowing the person, it's called rehabilitations and corrections, and there is none of that happens in the prison system. Guys can help themselves and change themselves, and I know several guys who should be on parole, but due to the fact that the parole board has about 4,500 people that they have to supervise, if they let these guys out, they don't have a job. So in 1996, they had what's called Truth in Sentencing Bill, where if you're convicted of a crime today, you know what day you're getting out of prison. That day, you know the day you're getting out. You can get good behavior and make it shorter, but if you were sentenced before that, you have an indefinite sentence and you have to see the parole board. There's guys in prison right now for crimes that people are committing today, doing 3, 4, 5 years for, who've been in prison for 25 plus years for the exact same thing. And the only reason they're not released is because if you let them out, then they lose their job eventually. And that's sickening to be worried about something like that instead of human life. And that's all I'm saying about the program.
Oh,
Go ahead.
I believe I have the.
Oh, yeah.
You mentioned Desmond Atkins.
Dwayne Jameson?
Right, Jameson,
Yeah.
right. He was on a walk with me and others, a walk against executions about 3 years ago. He's a wonderful guy, and you said he came that close to being murdered by the state of Ohio.
6 times. 6 days of execution.
Oh my God.
He's been out 12 years. He lives up here in Middletown. He was actually, he spoke with me at Schroeder High School. He just came back from
really?
17 days on tour in Texas.
Oh,
against the death
okay.
penalty.
So he's okay? 'Cause
Yeah.
I don't see him on Facebook anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
That's why I wondered. I'm so glad you could go fishing with your father.
Love it.
Thank God.
Love it. I always win, though. I have to show him how to fish again. I have to show him what the big fish look like.
Okay. A couple questions. It sounded like they offered you a plea deal. Do you have a sense for how many folks were in prison just to escape what you had to go through in terms of, I'll take the plea deal because it's smaller. The other one is, what impact do you think private prisons have on the political atmosphere and this kind of stuff?
I want to say a little bit about that, and then I'll let Donald talk about it too. But I was released in 2011. When I was released, the Ohio prison system still controlled the food in prison, the chow hall. It was $1.15 a day to feed a grown man 3 meals. I don't know what restaurant you get that deal at, but that's what it was then.
Not here.
Yeah, since I left, they privatized the food industry in prison. And right now, it's 85 cents a day to feed a grown man 3 meals. I don't know how some of these young kids are surviving in there on that food. The prison nutrition thing is based on calories, not nutrition. So what you get is cake, jelly, things like that. There's no nutritional value to it whatsoever. Gary Moore, who's the director of the prisons in Ohio, was a director, left, went out west, ran a private prison system out there. Kasich had him come back, and they're slowly trying to privatize the prison. When you have an industry that is for profit, and then they're over human lives, the profit is going to be over and it's, just like any other industry, it's going to overpower what the human life's all about in there.
Like healthcare.
The non-existent healthcare. Yeah, that the non-existent healthcare in prison. But what was the other thing?
Plea bargain.
The plea bargain. The plea bargain is huge, especially if you have dealt with the system before. You know how crooked it is. And I would say there is quite a few people who just took the deal because they knew it can be worse. It can be a lot worse than what was coming in. They'll wait and take the deal. And then you put this other law in effect where people are going to be in charge of, victims will be able to say in this, it starts slowing this thing down so much. I mean, court's so slow to start with, and then it's just going to slow it down so much that it's just going to be crazy. The biggest issue with me with the prison system is the prisons in Ohio are cram-packed with drug addicts.
Yeah.
Not drug pushers, drug addicts. There is nothing in prison to help a drug addict. You just lay there without drugs until your time is up, and then you're kicked right back out onto the street with $75 in your pocket to go where? Right back where you was at. There needs to be some other measures than locking drug addicts up in prison and filling them up with drug addicts. We need to have some other system and have drug dealers, drug pushers, drug manufacturers, not drug addicts.
Yeah, and just to add my 2 cents to a couple of those things, we don't know the numbers on wrongful incarcerations of people who have pled guilty. Although a lot more attention is being paid to it lately, both in the popular press and the academy. The National Innocence Project has recently started a project devoted to that. There's a website, guiltypleaproblem.org, that you can go to and visit. About 3 years ago, a federal judge out in New York, Jed Rakoff, wrote an article for the New Yorker on the problem with actually it was the New York Review of Books, on the problem. You can Google that, Jed Rakoff, Why Innocent People Plead Guilty, and there's all sorts of resources around it right now. Dean was talking about the problem, Dean was talking about mass incarceration. That's an issue that's finally, and the other thing is, guilty plea problems invoke other issues with them. It invokes the problem with broad prosecutorial discretion, that essentially the charging discretion given to prosecutors sort of dictates what the outcome of the case is going to be. It also invokes the problem with cash bail. People sit in jail simply because they cannot afford to post a bail or bond, and then they plead guilty simply to get out of jail. And that's not the way any of that was supposed to be. As for private prisons, we have 2 in Ohio, Lake Erie Correctional, North Central Correctional. I've been to both of them in the last 12 months. You can tell the difference between Ohio's prisons and the private prisons. Believe it or not, the public prisons are nicer. To the extent you didn't say a prison is nice, the public prisons are clearly better run than the private prisons are, and that's from a guy who doesn't get any further than the visitation room. So, and before you get confident that medical care is handled better if it isn't privatized, even in the publicly run prisons, it is largely privatized. ODRC, almost all of the county jails, including Hamilton County, farm out health care in the jail to a private company. Hamilton County has a contract with a private company. It used to be a group called Wexford. I think it's somebody else now. The private prisons also use private companies to send doctors in on locum tenens contracts. They are about profit first. David Singleton at OJPC did a great job about almost 10 years ago now, filing a class action against the prisons to try to get system-wide reform. There were some steps taken, but there's more work that needs to be done.
Got 2 more questions.
I just want to say this, there's 2.3 million people in the United States prison system. So when we're talking about wrongful convictions, if you just take a few, 4, 5, 6% of that, it's an astronomical number. We believe it's way higher than that, but they're saying 5%. So you start factoring that number in on how many people could possibly be innocent in prison could be outstanding.
Yeah, I was just delighted to hear what you had to say about issue 1, because what I think is really sick about the whole pushing publicly victims' rights is that it fosters a vengeance mentality. We don't need that. I mean, people who have suffered a real crime like eating, they need some kind of therapy, whether it's fishing or whatever. They don't need vengeance. I'm not religious, but I always like the line, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord."
Yeah, and I don't mean to sound heartless, but in the United States, we've always had 2 different justice systems. We have a civil justice system, and that's the system in which a victim personally gets redressed. We have the criminal justice system, which is where society gets redressed for the harm that's committed when a crime occurs.
I'd like to thank you for addressing the food issue. I'm afraid I'm going to cry. This is a little hard for me to address. My brother was in jail for something he didn't deserve to be in jail for drunk driving and driving without a license multiple times. He ended up being in there for 6 months. The lack of food was so serious of a problem that during that time he lost 30 pounds. He was already very thin. Men that were in the jail with him frequently talked about wanting to hit somebody to start a fight bad enough that would get them in prison because they had been informed that they would be better fed if they were in prison. And I paid money into his account so that he could order crackers and cheese from this, because they could only order from vendors. They couldn't get real food. So the food that you could hope to get were crackers and cheese or peanut butter and cheese, those little things like you get out of a slot machine. That's the kind of food that they were eating. This has also been confirmed by a woman who is testifying in front of Congress right now about the food issue in our jail system. And to address what you're saying, how many, you said, I don't know how these young guys get by. This is a developmental issue, by the way. I'm a clinical psychologist, retired right now. This is a serious brain development issue for people that are very young to be in jail or in prison going without sufficient food. It is actually causing brain damage and obviously other physical damage. I find it's a problem that in America we don't talk about that people are not getting fed while they're in jail and prison. And by the way, there's great regional differences in that regard, you know.
And with state court and federal court, or prisons, there's huge differences. I weighed 120 pounds when I got out of prison. No, not really. But I tell you what, I was definitely a lot thinner. Yeah, mom's biscuits and gravy.
You look happier now.
Yeah, yeah. The food it's terrible, and you know, so a person's committed to a prison for crimes they committed. They're still humans. They're still human beings, and you know, there's still things that should be in place, especially food, and just like I said, the drug addiction thing. You know, there has to be. They got NA and they got AA in prison. It's all voluntary, and you know, basically that is if you've decided you want to make a change. You know, and that's helping. There is other things that has to go on before you can really mentally decide that you're done with drugs. I can go on and on. I'm here all day if you want.
Well, we'll let you speak to people individually after this. I'm going to call it quits here. But Dean Gillespie and Donald Castor, thank you so much for coming. You were wonderful. I learned a lot. I'm feeling unhappy about having eaten that nice lunch, feeling like other people are not eating. I really am sorry for your brother. I have a couple more announcements. Next week, How to Create Strategy for Democrats to Protect Our Republic by Richard Azimus. On the November 21st, Child Poverty in Cincinnati by Esther Cleary. On the 28th, our Hamilton County Coroner, Lakshmi Semiko, is going to be coming. We have good programs for you in the next 3 weeks. Please think about coming. We have good things happening here. Your questions are great, folks. I love hearing your questions. I love hearing your participation in these discussions. You make me feel proud of Cincinnati. You really do. Thank you so much for coming. We need to finish the food. Now, talk about food, folks. We don't want to waste any food. That food needs to go home with you. If there's any food back there, it needs to go home. Please do not leave any food here. Go ahead.
If you all want to hear more on this subject, Mark will be speaking tomorrow night at the Mercantile Library. You have to have a reservation. It's free, but you have to reserve a spot. There might be 10 spots, Donald saying. We're talking about the guy, the director of this. He's going to be talking about his book, Blind Injustice, and you talking about a guy who knows what he's talking about. If you're interested in this subject, you will not be disappointed one bit.
Thank you for coming.